opportunities throughout the program. You can submit a question at any time using the Q&A panel. During Q&A, our panelists will answer as many questions as time allows. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Bridget Cooper, Grants and Contract Manager Specialist, University of Washington, who will start the conversation. Bridget.
Thank you, and welcome to NCURA's 2024 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series on empowering change, confronting racism to reshape social health determinants. Joining us for today's discussion is Izuagbe. She is an MPH candidate at Columbia University studying population and family health with a certification in health promotion. She graduated from the University of Washington in 2022 with a BA in public health with a focus on health promotion and education. During the summer of 2023, Rachel worked with Harlem Wellness Center to conduct a literature review on the impact of racial injustices on health of Black people in the United States. Her public health interests are health equity, Black maternal health, and health communication. She currently works with Zebra Strategies to conduct research for her hard-to-reach and marginalized communities. In her free time, she enjoys reading, trying new recipes, and blogging. Well, we have a lot to learn and unlearn today with today's informative presentation. So let's get started. Rachel?
Thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to have a conversation with you all, and thank you all for being here. First, I just want to start with an overview of the United States history. So just looking at the historical snapshot, for 246 years, American slavery persisted, and then for the next 86 years, legalized segregation compounded the injustices felt by Black and African American communities across the nation. And then today, the ramifications of our history still persist. So just looking at a brief timeline of the history of American slavery, in August 1619, the arrival of the first enslaved Africans from English pirates, and the first Black population come as involuntary laborers. Then enslavement is across the country. About 12.5 million Africans are kidnapped and enslaved. On July 4th, 1776, slavery is preserved when the Declaration of Independence fails to acknowledge and accept the equality of Black populations. And then on December 6, 1865, slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment in the United States. So I just want to get a read on the room. We have a poll, and I just want to know if you have heard of social determinants of health. And as you're thinking or reflecting on this word, social determinants of health are becoming more popular in day-to-day language. I actually had a conversation with my mom. She's a medical coder in a hospital in Washington State, and she told me that social determinants are becoming something they code for in patient charts. So it's becoming much more prevalent. We talk a lot about it in the public health field, but I'm just curious to know if you've heard of it, if you're familiar with it. And as responses are coming in, we'll share where we're at.
Right. On a previous college campus of mine, it actually housed an oil well rig. So in the back of one of the campus buildings, there's oil pumping. So there's many conversations about how that affected the community around it and what health implications. And it wasn't really addressed, except that it was falling on a college community. And the students became interested on what the cause was, and it became much more aware. So I think we have to stay aware on what we think are just there that could be affecting our overall health.
Right. And sometimes it's like easy to not think about it, but then suddenly it's impacting you. Okay, so from the poll, we're kind of like, we're almost like split in the room. There are 53% of us who have heard of it and 47 who haven't. So for some of you, some of the things I talk about might be familiar. For those who haven't heard of it, this may be a new and stimulating way to think about some historical events that you may be familiar with, but haven't thought about in the health lens. So I love that it's like very split. That's good to know. So for my presentation, I will be using the World Health Organization's definition of what social determinants are. So according to the World Health Organization, social determinants of health, also known as CDH, are the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes. So these are the conditions in which people are born in, where they grow, they work, they live, and age, and they are the wider set of forces and systems that are shaping the conditions of daily life. So these forces and systems include the economic policies and systems, development of agendas, social norms, social policies, and political systems. And for this presentation, I am choosing these 5 social determinants of health to frame these different historical events. So we will have economic stability, neighborhood and physical environment, education access and quality, community and social context, and then healthcare access and quality. So for each section, I will share the definition, I will give a timeline of some events that happened, and then we'll talk more deeply about those impacts on health today. But for starters, I will start with economic stability, which is the ability to financially access resources and maintain steady income, and it also involves poverty level. So a key moment in the history that greatly impacted economic stability for a lot of Black Americans in the US was the war on drugs. So the war on drugs is a huge event that had an impact on the Black community. On the picture on the left, it's Richard Nixon, former president, and he identified drug abuse as a quote, a serious national threat, and by 1971 officially declared the war on drugs. So he created the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the DEA was created to control the growing drug problem in the United States. So the war on drugs is also the catalyst for mass incarceration, leading to high amounts of Black people being placed in prison for minor offenses. And on the photo on the right, that is Brownsville, New York City. And this is currently the highest rate of incarceration among Black and Hispanic populations, primarily men, due to low-level nonviolent drug offenses. So just painting the picture for the war on drugs. Um, just as we're thinking about incarceration in the US, we have a second poll. And I would just like for you all to just guess how much money you think the US spends on keeping people in prison. So just take your best guess. Um, there is a lot of conversation about where money goes in the US when it comes to health, when it comes to education, social services, supporting people. We talk a lot about the prison industrial con, um, complex, excuse me. So I'm just curious if you all have a guess on how much money we go to keeping people in prison. And the options are 50 million, 20 million, 80 billion, and 40 billion. So,
We're keeping in mind, these are millions and billions of
yeah,
dollars.
and money that,
Money that could be offered to various resources, and
yeah.
even within our research administration, it could be offered for funding, especially to
Mhm.
marginalized and diverse institutions.
Yes. And then, really going into depth on some of the topics that we're going to talk about, could be super helpful having that money towards those research topics. So we'll see what everyone is guessing. Okay, so we have about 16% of you saying 50 million. I see 4% for 20 million, 43% for 80 billion, and then 37% for 40 billion. And the correct answer is $80 billion. So, oops. Majority of you all guessed correctly. So the US spends roughly $80 billion to keep 2.3 million people behind bars. And with this, something a lot of people don't know is that the families overwhelmingly shoulder that financial burden. And primarily the women in those families are carrying that financial burden because these families are being left behind by the person who is being incarcerated. And it impacts their ability to support themselves emotionally and financially. There's also data on how much money is spent per family and the average debt. So, in a New York Times article, there was a woman who shared a story about how she often trades off this to support her boyfriend who is incarcerated and to pay her own rent. And there is this distinction where these people in relationships, these people with family want to continue to be there for their partners, for family members, for loved ones, and are struggling to make those decisions, knowing that they may be in a more severe situation than they are, but outside, they're financially struggling. They're dealing with a lot of the emotional burden of having someone who is incarcerated. So just seeing the numbers, like it's very big. 2.9 billion is the amount across the US that families spend on supporting their family, being in communication with them. And then the average family debt for court fees, restitution, and fines is 13,000. So not only are these families feeling the emotional burden of having someone they love be incarcerated, they're also feeling those financially. So when people who are recently incarcerated do re-enter the workforce, they are hit with so many barriers that also impact their financial ability to just reacclimate and really re-enter society. So more than 44,000 federal, state, and local restrictions are placed on people who have a criminal conviction. 60% of formerly incarcerated people remain unemployed even 1 year after their release from prison. And for incarcerated populations, the only employment options available tend to be low paying and unstable jobs that really provide no potential for wage increases. And there's a 2 decade long study that found prison time actually reduces wages by 20%. And the effects of incarceration on lowering wages is higher among Black workers. So this leads to people who are recently freed from incarceration to being really dependent on their family members, rather over other sources of reentry programs with CBOs and organizations. So again, that like economic, that emotional burden is heavily weighted on the family and the individual, and there really is a lack of support to help people re-enter society and have that stable foundation to help their family and just to live. So another poll, I'm just curious to know if any of you know someone or have been impacted by the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system impacts a lot of people, either directly or indirectly. And I also share in the presentation, it has a lot of impacts on health. And I'm just curious to get like a feel in the room if people have personal experiences or know loved ones who have been impacted by the criminal justice system.
One fun, I say fun, but very encouraging fact is there is this woman who was previously incarcerated, recently went viral. Her name was Africa O's because she did pass the New York State bar on her first try, which is less than
Oh,
1% and of Black women passing the state bar and lower than that for formerly incarcerated people to pass. So if you haven't educated yourself on this individual, it's just a champion story to those that have been marginalized and dismissed to be able to reintroduce themselves into the justice
mhm.
system to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves.
Right. And there was a time I did an internship during college, and we learned about this reentry program for people who were interested in going to college. And it's like you hear these stories, and people have passions and they want to contribute and do these things with their lives, but the barriers really keep them from being able to do that. Okay, so we have again like kind of split, but about 59% of you have either been impacted or know someone who has been impacted by the criminal justice system. Um, so I'm glad like we have that context, and I will talk more about like things maybe that you've experienced with your own health or seen other people experienced. But just a few ways that the incarceration process and the criminal justice system really impacts the health of family members. The emotional, mental, and physical health are all impacted. So like I said earlier, the emotional toll of having someone in prison is very draining. People can feel depressed, they can feel anxious, they're very stressed thinking about their family members and finding ways to support them. And just the combination of that financial impact, the change of that family member being gone, not knowing if they'll come home, if they won't come home, having to have those trips to go see them, and just being in a setting where it's not very comforting to see someone you love. So that can be very stressful for family members. Mental health, there's increased stress that can lead to chronic stress and depression, which chronic stress is horrible for your health. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But even children who have parents who are incarcerated, in those developmental years, having these experiences can really impact them. And one way is having antisocial behavior. A lot of situations, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, can impact a child's ability to develop and can impact their future health on the life course. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But even an example physically is children can experience an increased risk of substance abuse, STIs, and suicide ideation. And even thinking about the substance abuse, starting with the war on drugs, this positive feedback loop of having potentially a parent who's incarcerated for a low minor offense, not having them in your life, developing depression or anxiety or stress, and using substances to cope can then reinforce the cycle where they're more likely to be targeted and arrested, and then have that cycle continue. And just a combination of like the barriers to employment, the lack of support systems for people who are recently incarcerated really sets up these barriers that impact financial, familial ties, and health.
So while you were conducting your research, Rachel, were you running into any researchers that their personal upbringing or experiences affected the way that they maybe interacted with the research you were doing or provided information to you through the various and maybe cultural backgrounds while you were conducting?
Mhm. That's a really good question. I feel like a lot of the research I saw, I didn't see a lot of like personal like anecdotes or like experiences coming in. It was much more just like, okay, we're gonna look at this association between like this health outcome and these populations. I'm sure that some of the researchers may have had like their own personal ties, but it did seem like more of the, oh, like we're doing this research on this population and we're going to see what findings they have, and less of like, okay, like this is something that is connected to me, something has impacted me, and here's kind of like the influence. So I feel like that was something I noticed. I'm not sure if it's just like researchers' backgrounds or if it's just like the conciseness of like the findings. But yeah, so I kind of noticed that a lot. I think in other anecdotal experiences, I saw a lot more of those connections between the people and the research.
And while we're going through this, audience, if there's any members that have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A, and as we can address them, we'll bring them up to Rachel as she goes along in her presentation.
So now I'm going to talk more about the history of how government policies have impacted the neighborhoods and physical environments. So the neighborhood and physical environment, this encompasses the places where people are born, where they live and learn, where they work, play, and worship. It has to do with housing security and the environmental conditions in those spaces. So for example, here is a timeline of just different housing discriminatory policies that we've seen in the US, starting from the forced removal of the Seneca Village here in New York City at Central Park, all the way to the Fair Housing Act. So I will go through three key historical discriminatory practices in more detail, starting with the early zoning laws. So early zoning laws, the first of the housing discriminatory practices, began with George W.F. McKinnon. In the summer of 1910, George, he's a black Yale Law graduate and practicing attorney. He bought a house on an all-white block in Baltimore, which sparked unrest in the white neighborhood. In response, just a few months later, on December 20th, 1910, the mayor signed the Baltimore Ordinance into law, segregation law in the United States. Baltimore soon after became a national leader in segregation, which quickly led to the adoption of residential segregation by other southern and border cities between 1912 and 1914. And these included North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Kentucky, South Carolina, Alabama, and Missouri. So then by the 1920s, the most sought after homes and neighborhoods were reserved for white communities, and racial segregation was reinforced. The next biggest housing discriminatory act was the racially restrictive covenants. And these began in 1926 with the support of the Supreme Court. So a lot of this is legal. These contract agreements banned buyers from taking certain actions after purchasing a property and were used to exclude minority communities. One example was the inability for white homeowners to sell their homes to Black families. And it wasn't until 1948 that these covenants were no longer legally enforced. And I think lastly, but I think the most like well known is the HOLC's redlining practices. So the maps on the left are 3 cities. On the far left is the greater Seattle area. There's New Orleans and there's Oakland. In some of the resources I'll be sending out after this, there's actually an interactive map where you can see what it was like to look across the United States and be in the 1930s to 1940s and see what they say about these cities and how they would grade them. So my presentation is mostly based on the United States, but redlining practices, they have different names and they happen all around the world. For example, like all the way in Austria in Europe and to South Africa. So I'll be focusing more on the United States context, but just putting that out there. Or sorry, not Austria, Amsterdam to South Africa. But the Homeowners Loan Corporation, they were the people who started redlining during the 1930s. And they created these maps and color-coded neighborhoods based on the security and the desirability, which dictated the likelihood of residents getting home loans. So on the right, I have the A graded, which is most desirable. B graded is still desirable. C is definitely declining, and D is hazardous. And on the map shown, you can see some of this color coding. I am from Washington State. I did my undergrad in Seattle, and the red areas, one of them is Central District, which is still predominantly a Black neighborhood, but it is becoming gentrified. There is a high school there that I was mentoring at, and one of the issues that was popping up was it's a really good high school. A lot of Black students go there, but now that it's becoming a better school and people want to go there, a lot of the Black students are being pushed out of those neighborhoods and having to commute further to receive that same education. So it's like now we're seeing this like, okay, like this is originally seen as a declining or hazardous area, but then as things develop and people shift, now it's becoming a more desirable area for people to live in, but it's now displacing the people who have been there for generations. So the majority of Black and African American communities were given these degraded redline neighborhoods, and this made it seem like these neighborhoods were unsafe, and these homeowners should not give loans to residents who live there. And it wasn't until 1968 that redlining was legally prohibited when President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So wasn't that long ago. My dad was alive during that time and he was born. So just like thinking about that context, sometimes we think about the United States history as something that's like so long ago, but there's people's parents and grandparents who lived in these neighborhoods and still live there. So I just think having that context is really important when we're talking about things in the past, because for a lot of us, those are still our present and maybe the future if we do not make changes.
I agree. Like that's a story that stood out with my mother. She grew up in the San Francisco area in the Mission District, and she can actively remember and share the stories of me when people of color started coming into her neighborhoods. And
Right.
because of the lifting of the red lining and allowing other people to buy family homes within the area. So it's very interesting because by the time I was there, it just seemed normal in the area, but she has a very stark remembering of when the change occurred.
Yeah, and even because I'm 24, I'm still seeing the world. So sometimes I'm like having these conversations, and I get to do like the research and like really like think more about it, and then hearing from personal experiences, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm talking to someone who could tell me like what was it like being there. I was at an event in Harlem, and I asked someone, I was like, oh, like, are you from the city? And she's like, yes, like I grew up in Harlem. And I was like, what's different about it? And she was just like, there's no more Black people, like everyone's leaving. So it's just like having that, I think that pre-existing experience and then existing and seeing it all change and then being there, it's like this research is important because people have these experiences, and being able to say that and have it all laid out, I feel like is so important.
And
So
making sure you're having those intergenerational conversations, because
mhm,
you were 24. If you flip that on its other way, that's me. And I've seen the change within the development of even how things are referenced. So when we're talking about marginalized and disparities, there's places like South Central that has been now called Central LA, and that kind of takes away from the identity and the culture that people had, so that developers can then come in and change, to your
mhm,
point, cause gentrification and what may have you, pushing individuals who know nothing but this area forced to go to new areas that they're not familiar with.
right.
Thank you for sharing that part with us and making sure that all of our members make sure to have these conversations, so that we do understand that a lot of this in the 1960s was not very long ago.
Mhm,
When the younger generation jokes and say we're born in the 1900s, we need to remind them it's not the 1700s or the 1800s. And these conversations need to continue to happen to realize their current
mhm.
relevancy.
And I'll have a whole section on gentrification, so we'll have more to discuss. Um, but yeah, so just like looking at the FHA's guidelines for neighborhood security, the Federal Housing Administration, when describing what constitutes as the security and stability of a neighborhood in relation to these redlining practices, they stated that if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values. Just gonna let that sit there for a second.
So really think about that and process what this statement is saying.
Right. This is from the Federal Housing Administration saying that racial and social groups should not be mixing in neighborhoods, that if they do, the value is going to decline. And this is solely based on people's race, how much money they make. Genetically, we're all the same. So just like showing that like how racism was so explicit in this policy. And although things may have changed legally, that like legal segregation is no longer allowed, if these families were living in these neighborhoods, they could not get these loans. And having a home is like the American dream. And then not being able to have this home, not being have that financial stability, like this is really the foundation economically and neighborhood wise. And neighborhoods impact education, access to jobs, so many things. Like this statement, like reading it out loud again, like makes you like, ugh, that hurts my stomach. Because it is, I think to this day, still a huge issue. And I think something that is severely overlooked when we're thinking about health.
And today is kind of umbrella of corporate overbuying. So now, instead of your mom and pop and your local, your individuals, you have corporations buying massive homes and then creating this significant socioeconomic gap as to where people can afford to buy, to rent. And we see that just being exacerbated in the current market.
Mhm. Yeah, so just want to have on the screen for a little bit.
We can go ahead and move on.
Okay. So now I want to talk more about white flight, which again, I think is something that people kind of forget about. So white flight refers to the mass exodus of white people retreating from an increasingly diverse area. And this was occurring primarily in the mid-20th century of the migration of households from cities to the suburbs as more people of color moved into the American urban neighborhoods. So just with the framework, it's already so hard to get a loan to have a home. More Black people are moving into the city. And now white people are like, we don't want to mix. We don't want this area. We want to go to the suburbs and have that separation. So for every Black resident who moved into a northern or western city, two white residents would leave for the suburbs. And these housing practices were like the marriage of racism and capitalism. So blockbusting became a practice where people would sell to Black families, and then they would scare white families to sell their houses. So then they can continue to sell to Black families and have a revenue. So using this like racialized fear, using racism to help them make a profit. Um, So with white flight, there are a lot of impacts that it had on the Black community. So resources were drained from the Black community. An example of this is in schools. Schools with fewer white students are less likely to have sufficient money per student. So the more Black families that move in, white families leave, and so does the money. So these schools become segregated, they stay segregated, and they don't have the same resources or funding that a school in a white neighborhood would have. Also, with taxes, tax dollars, if these neighborhoods don't have a lot of like strong financial mobility and foundations to start with, there's just not a lot of money that can go into that school. Um, Financial investments are diverted to white neighborhoods, leaving Black neighborhoods to be underinvested in infrastructure, businesses, and schools. And then the lack of home ownership also plays into the cycle of poverty by causing a lack of economic mobility that can secure access to quality healthcare. So if people are renting out places, if they are just finding places that are affordable or cheaper, these places are more likely to be polluted, to have lead, to have a lot of environmental hazards that people who have more money can't avoid. So it just becomes this environment where people are really just trying to move into a neighborhood, maybe start a family, have a stable life, but the finances are not there to support them.
And a lot of property taxes due to home ownership are tied to funding of schools in the neighborhood. So if you're not able to provide your input that way, and it's also a nod to voting and understanding your local and district voting on a smaller level and how that affects you and your community.
Right. It's a lot. It's a lot that goes into it. And um, even just thinking about like the more hazardous environment is, like how walkable is that neighborhood? Are people able to go on around? Is the air clean? All of those things impact. And even like with voting, especially, it's like if you are involved, if you have that time, um, like are you aware of what's going on? Because sometimes bills come out, people don't vote and it's impacting them, or they do vote for something and it's like not as genuine as they thought it would be, and it's not supporting and helping the communities in the way that it should be. So on the screen, I just have this graph of Gary, Indiana, and it's just showing over time the racial demographics between white, Black, or African American, and then Hispanic or Latino. And the brown line is for Black or African American, the white or the gray line is for white. And you can see that as you can see the demographics are changing between white and Black. So around 1950 to 1960, when desegregation is beginning, you can see that the Black community is starting to increase into these neighborhoods, and you can see that the white community starts to plateau and then decreases as more Black people move into the neighborhoods. So this is just another like form of information to just like show like people were leaving these neighborhoods and were not interested in desegregating. So just some indirect consequences of white flight and how it impacts students. So white flight segregates students. So white students have limited exposure to students of color, which can reinforce a lot of the negative stereotypes that they may have. Since they're not meeting these people, they aren't seeing them as just like people like them. From my upbringing, I grew up near a military base. So a lot of my friends were coming from the South. They're coming from like all over the country. And having that experience, it's like, oh, like, okay, like I'm Nigerian, and like people are like, oh, like your parents are like from Africa. I'm like, yeah, they are. And we can have those conversations. People from Guam, like all over the country, all over the world. And like having that just kind of lets you see like everyone is like you. There are cultural differences, there are cultural similarities. But when you're having students in these separate spaces, whatever they hear on the news, whatever racist things they hear that they're taught to them, there is nothing to challenge that thinking. So they are more likely to reinforce these stereotypes and then carry those beliefs into adulthood. And the impact this has on health is that there was a study that said that there may be association between police killings and segregation, that police killings may have some roots in the fact that a lot of white officers attended racially segregated schools. So again, if they are not having these stereotypes challenged, that is the belief they have, whether explicit or implicit, and that is really going to determine their judgment when they are like a white officer in a Black community or predominantly non-white community and having to police these people.
And in
So
your studies, did you find interesting disparities between profiling and how that might affect the mentality and maybe like PTSD on particular racial groups?
I did. I actually have a whole section about that in this presentation to talk more about like stop and frisk, all those things, and the impact on children, but also on women who are pregnant and how that impacts them. So I will jump into that later, but I did pull some information about that. So yes. Um, yeah, so as we talked about gentrification, I would like to say some modern day redlining. I actually have the example of Central District changing from a Black to majority white neighborhood. So gentrification occurs when central urban neighborhoods undergo disinvestments and economic decline, but are now being reinvested into so that well-off middle class and upper class people can move in. So this displaces people who are already in the neighborhood and who have lived there for generations. And I say this is modern day redlining because it's a new way to push Black people out of home ownership and to the side of society. So in these pictures, I have the historically Black neighborhoods like Central District becoming more white. Like I said before, Garfield High School is a predominantly Black school that is now seeing a lot of their students having to commute to come to classes, which just causes a lot of barriers on these students. And across Seattle, the displacement is seen. For example, on the map on the left, it is looking at the displacement risk. And we have the light rail system. And for that, it's like there's this benefit where it's like, okay, like I can commute without a car. If I'm going from like Northgate down to the airport, like on that line, it's very helpful. It brings people access to different resources, to jobs, and makes it easier to get around. But this does bring businesses that can increase rent and push people out. And when there aren't any like safety nets or anything to really help people who have been living there, these people get pushed out. And you can see the darker blue is very high displacement, while the white is very low. And along the light rail going down, you can see that, and also going into South Seattle, where there are primarily a lot of immigrant and people of color in those areas. So there's sometimes like these either intended or unintended consequences that aren't really thought about. And I'm a huge advocate for public health in every field to think about how this might impact health. When you're building construction, how is this impacting people? Is this going to displace people? How are we going to make sure that like although new businesses might come and people can still afford to live here? There's a lot that could go into that thought process. And right now I think it's very separate and people aren't thinking about it that way. But those are just like some examples from where I'm familiar with how redlining, I think, has transformed into gentrification.
In your experience, how is the overlap between I'm sorry, it just went out my head, the question that was asked, but basically the overlap between urban city planning and public health and what you just spoke of, are those being implemented when they're thinking about future urban development planning and its effect on people, or is it still more of an afterthought in your research?
I feel like there are some people who advocate for like this like intersection where it's like, okay, like people who are like, when you're like thinking like, okay, like we're gonna expand the light rail. Like, who are the stakeholders who are included in these conversations? I think public health practitioners, people in the community. Like, I think there's like this public health 3.0 where it's like, okay, like everyone is in conversation, they work together. In King County, like for example, like, you know, let's have the public health department and the like Department of Transportation have these meetings, have these conversations. And I think I've seen people talk about that. And that's something that I'm like interested is how do we like have this intersection? So I've seen some of that. But in practice, I don't know how frequently that is actually done. From the conversations, it sounds like something that some people think of, but I think it's much more of an afterthought. And I think something happens, and then people are like, oh, like we should research this. But it's like, okay, like the damage is done now. How can we use this lesson in the future, the next time that there is something that needs to be developed? How are we including a lot of voices? And I just think public health practitioners and the community need to be like in the stakeholders in those conversations. So I have seen some people advocate for more of that intersection between multiple departments. So yeah,
Thank you.
of course. So another impact of redlining is just the lack of green space. So the photos I have on the screen are Capitol Hill versus Central Districts and Beacon Hill. So green space offers recreational and vegetation space within urban areas. So thinking of like New York City, we have Central Park. Just like having these green spaces where people can walk safely, they can be outdoors while still living in like a very heavy urban area. So green space offers a lot for us. It promotes physical activity and it gives safe spaces for children and older people to walk, to play, to just hang out. And greenery can be sparsely or completely inaccessible in some neighborhoods. And this again is a consequence of redlining. So on the screen, I have a photo in Capitol Hill, and you can see the amount of trees that are in this neighborhood, which offers a lot of shade. Unfortunately, in the Seattle area, our summers are getting hotter. So like having this greenery, the shade, having access to the water are all things that like people will need as the climate starts to change. But at the bottom, you see like in like Central District, the Beacon Hill area, there is just a lack of trees. It's very open. You can see that the grass is like dying. There's less upkeep. And the difference between the two areas, Capitol Hill was considered still desirable. The Central District, the Beacon Hill area were considered hazardous. So the lack of investment in these areas is shown today just by seeing like the number of trees. And that again is like something like if you're not like really thinking about it, just, you know, it's like, oh, you're just driving, you're just walking, you don't think much about it. But because of this, neighborhoods that are historically redlined are just less likely to have a lot of green space. They have more low income and people of color in those neighborhoods, so they're disproportionately impacted by this. And that's going to impact people's ability to go on walks, to have access to clean air, to have places to play. And the impacts of housing discrimination is made especially evident through the health disparities and the living conditions and lifestyles that people have today.
And you can also see that correlation through some of the recent protests, and the way they discouraged was actually cutting back of the trees and disallowance of the shade to be able to, maybe retire faster and not protest throughout the evening. So you see that some of these tactics are used in multiple areas throughout the different communities to kind of squelch some of the free speech opportunities that one might have. So want also people to recognize the overlap of these tactics, regardless on whether it's redlining or various other ways to kind of reduce. Because what am I trying to say? So during protesting and things like this is where we're also getting into how these things change. So using the same tactics to prevent the possible prevention of change, to your point, because this is just how it was, what can we do different? So keeping all of this in mind while we're researchers and we're thinking about ways to expand our diversity and inclusion on how we propose and how we think about proposal submissions and funding.
And I think even to the other side, it's so, I think, empowering seeing communities come together and how they communicate with each other. When those really hot days are coming, like coming and offering water and like having these resources to support each other. But yeah, like definitely though, like structurally, they're like, we need more. But yeah, that's a really great like connection to make. But yeah, so there was a poll, which of the following is an indirect consequence of housing discrimination? And overwhelmingly, you all guessed correctly. All of the above: higher risk of preterm birth, cancer, poor mental health, and a ton of other negative health impacts are all consequences of the housing discrimination. So on the negative health effects, we see that higher risk of preterm births, lower life expectancy, cancer, tuberculosis, maternal depression, poor mental health, higher emergency room visits due to asthma, higher diabetes, and higher mental health visits. And then with the living conditions and lifestyles, there is just more exposure to environmental toxins, exposure to psychological stressors, housing and food insecurity, and then limited in education and financial opportunities, that lack of green space, and displacement. So there's a lot that happens. And even within public health, like environmental health is like a whole nother section to focus on, but they're all like under the umbrella. Even just thinking about like how close a home is to the street, how populated is that? How many cars are going by? Is there a place for children to play outside? Like there's so much that goes into it. Um, so I just really wanted to highlight like these direct impacts and also like the higher diabetes related mortality. I hear a lot of people talk about diabetes in the Black community. That is like something that's always on the radar, but there's kind of this lack of connection between like what are the causes of it. Of course, food and diet come play into it, but also it's just like, are people having access to these resources? What neighborhoods are they living in? So like having that connection, I think like having that connection of research where it's like, here's these medical conditions that we see, and then here are these actions that we can pinpoint the dates of when they occurred and having that connection so we can like have um these what's the word, I'm blanking right now, but like have these strategies or protective factors that we could put into place to prevent these health outcomes rather than focusing so much on the individual. Um, so focus on education, access, and quality, and the historical moments that have impacted these for the Black community. So for education, access, and quality, what is included in this social determinant are the access to quality institutions, childhood education, higher education, and then limited language and literacy barriers. So again, just starting with the timeline, 1865, the Jim Crow laws restrict education opportunities. 1954, Board of Education occurs in the Supreme Court. 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is passed. In 1980s, we start seeing this coining of school to prison pipeline. And then 1991, the Supreme Court ruling helps districts escape desegregation. So another poll, I want to just hear you all guess on what percentage of students in the US are still attending schools that are segregated. So with the timeline of 1954, Board of Education made segregation illegal. But with talking about like neighborhoods and how that really shaped who's living in what neighborhood with white flight, like all those changes, there are some places that are just like now like segregated, and with how property taxes and access to different schools impact that, students are going to places that are close, that are in their districts. So I just want to hear your guess. am currently living in New York, and I was going to like the different neighborhoods. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, like every neighborhood has like such a unique culture and like different groups. And then I was like, oh my gosh, like, is this segregation? Like, why are people like so separated? Um, but looking at the poll responses, I see 29% said 30%, 21 for 18, 26% for 26%, and then 24% for 50%. And the correct answer is actually 30%. So 30% of students in the US are still attending schools that are very segregated. And what was classified with that is that 75%, roughly 70 to 75% of the students are the same race that go to those schools. So even though there is like these desegregation efforts, a lot of students are still only in environments with their peers of the same race.
Yeah, it's interesting to think that 30% still in 2024 are segregated. However, we know there's some underlying issues as to why, as far as brown versus board and desegregation to help financially boost certain communities. But there's been studies that we know that it actually took away from said communities and decrease their financial wealth and the circulation of dollars within the community. So it's interesting when we say that segregation and your findings about it and what the benefits and like pros and cons are to each different communities.
Mhm. It even made me just think about the most recent presidential election, like busing and desegregation was a conversation in a 2020 election. So it's like it's still on people's minds. People are still being impacted. And again, just reinforces like these are events that are continuous, like they never ended. Um, so, with the ongoing segregation and racial discrimination, there were many efforts to improve educational opportunities throughout the 20th century. And I think the most famous is the Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, they ruled that school racial segregation was unconstitutional, which initiated the desegregation efforts that occurred in the 1960s and 1970s. The ESEA Act was passed, and it was aimed to provide federal funds to schools, students living in poverty, which reinforced school integration efforts. But as recent as 1991, the Supreme Court began issuing rulings that helped districts pretty much escape desegregation orders. And this led to 600 to 1,000 school districts now free of oversight of court-ordered desegregation. And today, many cities and schools throughout the country, especially in the north, remain segregated. In the photo on the right, this is a protest happening in 2018. So only a few years ago, hundreds of public school students in the New York City took part in demonstrations calling for more action to integrate schools. So the students are living it. It's still happening. Um, and just looking at the impacts of racial segregation, um, when comparing segregated schools to majority white schools and students, segregated schools have higher teacher turnover rates, there are less experienced teachers, there are limited resources, and poor quality classrooms. And then for Black children specifically in these schools, they have more poor health outcomes. This can include stress, psychosocial distress, mental health discrimination. They're more likely to engage in poor health behaviors such as alcohol consumption, poor diets, lower physical activity, and they are more likely to experience increased police presence and law enforcement. Um, it's even interesting thinking about like my upbringing. I went to a school that was more diverse than the schools in the district, and just seeing the difference between like having a campus security office on campus versus seeing other schools where there are metal detectors before you could enter school. So like just seeing those differences, like when the money goes to certain places, when it's desegregated, what that looks like, and the experiences for students, um, it's very different. And with the school to prison pipeline, I just want to say, like, I'm going to show a video that is violence of a police officer towards children. But I just wanted to show this. This is from 2016. And the school to prison pipeline is really just about how the disciplinary situations a lot of Black children have in schools can lead to them to being policed and lead to increased exposure to the criminal justice system. And I just want to show this short video of policing in a school setting. This video was created by Vox. It pretty much just describes what the school to prison pipeline is. But I just wanted to show this clip of a student being disciplined, being grabbed, being physically harmed by this officer. There are 2 videos.
Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system.
So I just want to share that, especially with the first clip. To me, when I saw this the first time, the lack of reaction of the students and the lack of reaction of the teacher, to me, sends a message that this is a very normalized thing. A child should never be touched this way, should never be harmed this way by a grown adult. But for some reason, I will go into more about the pretty much the demonization of Black children and Black bodies later in the presentation. But these are elementary age, maybe middle school age students. In the second video, you see a little girl crying, having her arms behind her back, like she has done something wrong. These children are being exposed very, very early to a police system that is harming them. When other students act out in class, they're sent to stand outside for a second, come back in the room. And these early experiences with violence, especially with police officers who are told to protect people, can really impact a child's experiences and their adolescent development. And the exposure to these high levels of exclusionary discipline and policing in schools likely produce and reproduce material and psychosocial conditions that can increase the risk of adolescent substance use and mental health problems, and really erode social supports and healthy development. And I think about what it was like to be in elementary school or high school, and if you were to act out, or how do teachers respond to different students, the way that students are taken out of the classroom when they're acting up, rather than having extra support in schools, and then that extra elevation of having law enforcement involved in these situations. I just remember from high school, there's some things that happened that I'm I will never forget this. I think I remember being in high school and knowing someone from a different school on the track team who was underage drinking at a school dance, and he got in trouble. He lost his scholarship to play a sport in college. And then being at a different school and knowing people who've been caught for underage drinking, and they came to school the next day. So it's this difference in discipline already kind of reinforces this idea that we are different. The system is going to treat us differently, and that is going to show up in our life course and our health. So there's a lot of things I'm passionate about, and this is
Right.
yeah. So I just really want to it's very interconnected. And again, with the mental health concerns, with the substance use, really setting up students to kind of be in the cycle. They're going to continue to engaging with the police force, with the criminal justice system, and just really impacting their health and the health of their families and loved ones. So yeah.
And as research administrators, we kind of tie this in because racial segregation can influence focus and priorities of research proposals. So being aware of the communities to which you're talking, or being an active listener to the researchers and investigators you're working with, to understand that certain research agendas could be shaped by the experiences and perspectives of the dominant racial group leading, and that knowing this, we can address gaps in addressing the relevant issues to the marginalized communities, making sure that we don't have further lack of diversity in research topics and methodologies, and overlooking critical issues that perpetuate existing inequalities. So tying into the knowledge of knowing how certain communities have grown up knowing these certain things and have these traumas and unconscious biases in their heads, and working towards our research and promoting funding and securing funding to help understand why certain things like this occur. And also, speaking to your point earlier on the increase of diabetes and things, I know I worked with an investigator that did a study in rural communities to find out how their diabetes and the high cardiovascular issues compared to those in urban communities within the various racial disparities. So we can remember, wow, this is super important information on public health. It ties always into our work as research administrators and how we go about creating and sustaining our proposal submissions and funding.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm very, very biased with public health, but I do think it's everywhere. So it's like having that like framework for me kind of helps me like, okay, like I'm gonna work on this. Like what is this? What is the lens? What is the background information? So yeah, completely agree. So I'm going to now transition us to our next social determinant of health, which is the community and social context. And for community and social context, this includes the level of social integration, civic participation, incarceration, social relationships. It also includes the experiences of stress, stigma, and discrimination. So there's a lot within this social determinant. So I won't be going through everything because that would honestly be a full other presentation. But just starting as early as 1814 with the origins of gerrymandering, something I actually learned, I included the like a map of um like a few cities like being like carved out for gerrymandering, and if you can see it, it kind of looks like a salamander, like a little lizard. And the person who actually came up with this idea, his name is Jerry, and then like the creature looks like a salamander, so they created gerrymandering. It's just a little fun fact for a not so fun topic, but um from 1814, the origins of gerrymandering, which we do to this day in every election, see how that plays out in different regions. 1860, I'll talk more about the brute caricature. 1865, the rise of voter suppression. 1865, the rise, we see more lynching. 1867, I'll go into Confederate monuments. 1910, we see the first wave of the Great Migration. World War I follows a few years later, the 1919 Red Summer, and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And then we see World War II, the next wave of the Great Migration, the Civil Rights Movement, the war on drugs being declared. We're seeing more TV and Black children in media. The Drug Abuse Act, I'll talk more in detail about that. And then in 1994, the Biden crime bill, which was talked a lot about in the most recent presidential election. But I want to focus a lot on the brute caricature. So this slide, I just really want to focus on the difference in language and representation of Black people in media, which I think ties back to the school to prison pipeline and how Black children are disciplined and treated in schools and how that impacts them throughout their life course. So on my left of the screen, there are books and movies that created stories of Black people to be violent and to endorse white supremacy. The Birth of a Nation is a film that portrays a Ku Klux Klan as heroes, and this played at the White House when it had first come out. In the middle of the screen, we see a Black woman being arrested by police officers during a BLM protest. And at the bottom, there is Kyle Rittenhouse. He's in the White House with the GOP members after being acquitted of murdering 3 people at a Black Lives Matter protest. And then on the far right of the screen, these are 2 tweets from Trump that refer to Black people who are peacefully protesting as thugs, while referring to the January 6th protesters who stormed the United States Capitol as protecting their country and not falling for a fraudulent election. So I just put these on here because there is a very different experience that people have. And the experiences of discrimination, of blatant racism really play into the health outcomes that people have. For my capstone project this spring, I actually did a research proposal to look at the association between experience of discrimination and suicide ideation amongst Black maternal health. And just seeing like, how does that impact people throughout pregnancy and afterwards? And I just, every time I think of like, especially thinking of the first tweet, I remember being in 2020 and trying to explain to someone that thugs is a euphemism. And having that disconnect was really, really difficult because, again, going back to the idea, if the media, if your conversations are never challenging your belief on certain people, there's always going to be this idea of like, oh, like what they're saying is true. Like these are thugs. They are coming in and breaking into these businesses and doing all these things, even though the majority of these people are actually protesting peacefully. Having someone in the highest seat of power in the United States say these things really kind of influence what kind of work is being done, what funding is going to departments, how is research being prioritized. And I think coming out of this and just seeing the juxtaposition of it all is very alarming and does tie into the health of these populations. Another photo I want to show is this Vogue magazine cover of LeBron James. Next to it is a drawing of King Kong. And the context for this magazine was having athletes and just like other professions who have to keep like really in shape, like models, basketball players, and just like talking about like fitness and diet and all those things. And I just want to say the photo that was chosen for the cover of this magazine has like literally nothing to do with diet, with fitness, with being an athlete. He has a basketball, but like that's pretty much it. And it actually replicates King Kong and this like damsel in distress, and just reinforces the idea and imagery of Black people being demonized, being associated with monkeys, just like not being like human beings. And like in this example, it is a Black man, but like this is seen with Black children, Black women, Black folks throughout the community. And like with the significance of these caricatures, they like really make Black people seem like they aren't human beings. And especially in a post-slavery context, when there is no longer this power where you can enslave people, there has to be a different way to kind of create this hierarchy. And this really kind of makes it so people who are consuming this, like there's not really a reason to like have empathy or like be able to relate to these people who are going through systematic barriers. And this made it really hard for people to integrate into society after a lot of policies were put in place to enforce that. And it also made it easier to rationalize lynching, which I'll talk a lot more about how lynching has impacted health today. So lynching increased the fear amongst Black people and kept them from voting, from organizing and working. These limit the opportunities that people have to really live fully healthy lives. When we think about like what foundations are needed for like a life to thrive, there are a lot of barriers that keep that for a lot of Black people. And without the collective power to vote and organize, people in power can continue to have this political backing to enforce racism. And they can continue, Black people continue to be in this trap cycle of not really being able to increase politically, to increase economically, and to really get the resources and stability that they need to be like fully operating in society. And without the ability to have like a high paying job, Black people are trapped in the cycle of poverty, the lack of political and financial support, and the very normalized racism just impacts the access to quality of healthcare if they were ever able to obtain it.
As we move on in your presentation and your research and providing this education to different individuals, have you ran into the topic of, or the description of DEI becoming a euphemism as thug or urban. And what is your kind of small feedback that you maybe could provide in your outlook on that?
I've actually not heard that before.
Mm.
I didn't know that was happening. Um, because it's like for me very interesting. For me, sometimes like
Mm.
it feels like certain words become more of like buzzwords. And like just saying like oh like we do DEI, like all these things, but I haven't heard it in the context of that. Like if you have more information, I'd love to hear like what.
We'll get some membership to let us know while you advance. Let us see. I think it'd be helpful for them to see the percentages of the lynching that you were speaking of on the next slide so that they can understand what you're saying while you're going through the topic.
Yeah, so with lynching, there have been direct links to health outcomes. So on the screen, I just have some percentages with 41%. Counties with the highest lynchings have the lowest primary care to physician ratio. So there are less physicians in those counties per person. And then 5.4% of counties have with more lynchings have higher rates of uninsured and unemployed individuals. So like not like a huge percentage, but still shows that there is something going on with those areas. And when it comes to the household income, counties that have more lynchings have lower median household incomes than those that either had less or no lynchings. Um, so historically, lynching is negatively associated with life expectancy. So in counties that have who had a history of lynching, the life expectancy in those areas is lower. And this is due to a higher percentage of uninsured and unemployed people, along with the decreased median household income and the higher inequality ratio and more violent crime rates. Um, and I just feel like this connection with lynching and health today really just shows that systemic issues persist. Um, and I also just wanted to focus a lot on Confederate monuments. I think
Before
that
you go on to the Confederate monuments, do you think there's any, you can go ahead and keep it on to the next slide, but we're wondering if you can give us any example of a modern day lynching or what example that,
mm,
is there anything that you could think of you could provide to us so that we can equate it to not just that this happened before, but there's ways that it's continuing to occur to groups today?
I think modern day lynching is the police brutality that we see a lot of people being killed um, all over the news. I think, especially the fact that there is a lack of legal accountability that happens in a lot of those cases. That I would equate to that. I think with the lynching, having people watch it, like historically they had postcards that people would send with images of people being lynched. I think creates this physical and mental safety hazard for Black people um, to not stand up for themselves, to not act a certain way. And I think with police brutality and social media and the news constantly showing that, it allows us to be informed and to try to hold people accountable, but it also reinforces this message of like, you see that on the news and your parents talk to you and it's like, okay, what do you do when you see a police officer? How do you react and all these things? And it just creates this power imbalance. So I really believe that like police brutality and that violence and that murder is what lynching is in our present day.
Thank you for giving us that example.
And yeah, I feel like with lynching, with police brutality, with Confederate monuments, these are things that are kind of like reminders of like, okay, like we can still do some stuff even if we can't legally do certain things. Um, so the quote on the screen is love home in its purity to protect from taint the Saxon blood that courses in your veins. And this quote comes from a former North Carolina court judge who was addressing a crowd at the unveiling of a Confederate monument. And I think, if I remember correctly, I feel like between 2016 2020, there's a lot in the news about Confederate monuments on college campuses or just the honoring of people who were on the side of the Confederate in our history and having their names associated with like very prestigious institutions. And a lot of the arguments for Confederate monuments are that people argue that Confederate symbols are all about Southern pride, but there is explicit evidence that these are rooted in racism. There was a research study that showed they examined 30 speeches related to Confederate monuments, and half of them use explicit language such as our Anglo-Saxon ancestors, love of our race, your own race and blood. And these speeches were invoking explicitly racist language. And at the decline of lynching being a socially acceptable act and the loss of the Confederate monuments became a new way to intimidate Black people and honor white supremacy. And these intimidation strategies create the psychological restrictions. And it's actually interesting because there was research that showed how these intimidation strategies can impact how people believe how ambitious they can be. And it's called success neurosis. And it's when one limits their own ambitions and self-actualization out of fear and guilt. And I thought this was really interesting because a lot of these Confederate monuments are on college campuses in a higher education setting. And it's already, like, speaking from personal experience, like the more you go to these like more like prestigious, I say in quotes, institutions, the less diverse it is. So there's already the struggle of imposter syndrome. Do I belong here? Having to kind of go through a lot of things if you're the first in your family to do these things. And then walking every day by a Confederate monument that fought for you to stay enslaved. So I just think this really impacts people's belief in themselves, their mental health, and can, again, indirectly impact, are they more likely to accept these jobs? Do they feel that they can, that they're qualified for these high wage jobs that have better health insurance, that have better access to these nice neighborhoods? So
Right.
again,
And as we move on, we also want to acknowledge the other modern day references to this. For example, it was recently, I believe last week, was Ahmaud Arbery's birthday. So he wasn't here to see like his 21st birthday, and the Say Our Name movement of all the lives that have been lost since 2020, of course, before and moving forward, but the highlight put on 2020, the, recognition of the mental anguish that these monuments put on individuals and the removal of said or not removal of said monuments. So keeping that in mind on how we can, again, just staying aware of what sometimes society wants us to think was far removed from politics or laws of current day. We'd like you to go ahead and advance as we move forward, because we want to keep on timelines. So thank you so much for giving and membership that good background and foundation in case they didn't know about that Confederate monuments and actually what it means mentally, especially the purposefully placement on higher education college campuses, which we also can tie today's to seeing the squelching of the free speech and the tearing down of the encampments now for various protests that are going on. So you can see how that might intimidate in certain places of the country as to why you might not want to utilize your free speech. So I see that we have another poll coming in, so I'll go ahead and pass that back to you.
yes. So for our next poll, I just want to, again, just get a feel if you all think or know if there's a difference between crack and cocaine. I'm going to move more into this presentation about the Drug Abuse Act. We touched on the war on drugs, but I just want to touch more on some of the policy and the impact of the criminal justice system on people. Okay, so I see I had the 49% say yes, there's a difference, 27 say no, and 24% say I don't know. Okay, so before I answer the question, I'll give some context and then I'll give the answer. So as the use of crack cocaine rises, Ronald Reagan signed the 1986 Drug Abuse Act into place. And according to research, there is virtually no real difference between crack and cocaine. Crack is cheaper, so more low-income people opt into buying this. And during this time, when a lot of people were using drugs and needed support, instead of focusing efforts towards public health and rehabilitation services, the act was penalized crack more harshly than cocaine. So 100 grams of cocaine is equal to 1 gram of crack. I'm going to say it one more time. 100 grams of cocaine is equal to 1 gram of crack. So primarily Black and other people of color are targeted and thrown into prison much more easily for crack possessions because of the 1986 Drug Act. And 100 grams is considered equal to 1 gram of crack, but research has shown there is really no difference between the two besides who is using it. A drug crime involving 5 grams of crack resulted in mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison, while crimes involving up to 500 grams of powder cocaine received a lower sentence recommendation. So
Before we move on, you want to also speak to the congruency of the no difference besides who was using it and the opioid pandemic, and how research got pushed into the drug companies. So, oh my goodness, let's find out what's going on here and what's happening. But the same thing cannot be said for the crack era. And again, who was using it and what communities were being disrupted by it. But when certain drugs get presented that affect a community that wasn't intentionally meant to be disrupted in said way, we see a lot of our funding and a lot of our dollars going into there. So there's another thing as research administrators to be aware of where are we putting our funding and who's and which communities are benefiting from it. And should those be the communities to which they should benefit from it?
Yeah, a lot of the opioid crisis, I feel like it's been targeting middle-class white people who are impacted. And everyone deserves access to harm reduction strategies for that support. But when all the research is being done and only showing those things, all of the resources are going to be only towards those communities when that empathy was not there for Black people during the crack epidemic. So yeah, that's a really, really important point. So just want to talk about racial profiling, and I'm gonna kind of speed through a couple of these just because we have another section to get through. But racial profiling is the act of suspecting or targeting a person of certain race on the basis of observed or assumed characteristics or behavior of a racial or ethnic group, rather than on individual suspicion. So police violence has a direct link to racial profiling, and witnessing or being a victim of police violence can affect mental, physical, and emotional health. In those situations, micro and macro aggressions from police can lead to escalation of interactions. Stop and frisk is when the police stop an individual to search them for things like weapons, and Black people are more likely to experience this. Stop and frisk is associated with adverse mental health effects such as stress responses or depressive symptoms. So the leading cause of death of Black boys between the age 15 and 19 and men 20 to 39 is homicide, and they are reported to have higher levels of anxiety and PTSD. And violence was directly reported to cause depression in Black boys and men, which act as a mediator for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, which again, we hear so much within the Black community, and cancer. And within maternal and infant health, there is an association between low birth weight among newborns and racial profiling among Black infants, but this association in that research today was not seen for other races. And just looking at continue into maternal health with mass incarceration, with the war on drugs and the Drug Act, the toxic stress of criminal justice systems contribute to the disparity rates of Black and white infant mortality. So the structural racism connects Black women to distinct stressors that undermine their health and the health of their children. And this stress can cultivate from generations. And like whatever, I think the saying is like your grandma's health impacts your health. So imagine your grandma going to school in a segregated environment. All that stress is being passed down to you.
And recently they have talked about not only your grandmother's health, but actually the health through the diaspora as the slaves have been migrated through whatever, and that is in our DNA as it's being trans down generational. So a lot more studies are also coming about that. So that's just tying it back into our research administration and what studies we can do and how far back, because a lot of it was not not research because of the individuals who is affecting, and two, keeping it to an immediacy and not really bringing in the factors from, 200 years ago that might also affect our health today.
Right. And even trying to find research on this was hard. There's not a lot. So I would appreciate more research proposals for it.
We all would. You hear that, research administrators? We need more research on this topic, and that's why we're bringing these subjects to you
Right.
today.
Yeah, and then children with incarcerated parents are more likely to experience housing instability, homelessness, and healthcare and nutrition insecurity. And then as adults have higher risk of poor health related quality of life. Okay, so we're going to move over to healthcare access and quality. This is our last social determinant. And what's included in this is the access to healthcare services, health insurance, culturally acceptable care, medical distress, health worker availability, and health literacy. So a brief timeline, starting all the way from 1537 on the lack of diversity in clinical trials, forced sterilization, the Great Depression, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, mass incarceration beginning, the Medical University of South Carolina being accused of illegal drug testing. So there's a ton within our medical history. And I just want to take a poll very quickly on how familiar people are with Henrietta Lacks' story. I just want to know if
And
you're...
I'm hoping that the answer is going to be high, seeing as annual meeting, that was the focus. And we did have the family of Miss Lax come and speak. So I'm really hoping that we get a high polling on very familiar. But if not, again, that's why we're here to educate the membership. And please go back to look at the previous slides and to make sure you read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah, I'm expecting.
He's going to break it down for us, but that's very important, right? To keep it on. NCURA is doing a great job of keeping these topics in our face, in front, and continuing the conversation, which is very important.
So from the poll, 52% say they're very familiar, 20% say somewhat, and 27 are not at all familiar. So I'll just give like some brief history and context on Henrietta Lacks' story. So there is too strong of a history of Black women being used as medical experience and not being seen as patients. And in 1951, Henrietta Lacks was a Southern Black tobacco farmer who had cervical cancer and was the source of cells at George Otto at Johns Hopkins, which is a huge public health institution today, took her cells to revolutionize medical research. After her death, the HeLa cell line remained alive for 25 years before the family was even aware that her cells were being used for research. So this really just kind of talked about the lack of informed consent within science. And one of the things that really stood out to me about the story was that her daughter, after she found out that her mom was being used for science, she asked if they'd killed her for her cells. And then they asked if their mother was so important to science, why they couldn't afford health insurance. So I just think her story really it needs to be talked about. I do think it is something that's more talked about. There is a story that I feel like is not very familiar with people. So again, I just want to get a feel how familiar people are with the Roth sisters. Again, very familiar, somewhat familiar, not at all familiar. There's a lot of stories, I think, in the medical history that pertain to Black women that are not talked about, that are often forgotten. And there are so many health disparities that Black women face that I feel like are tied to this gap. So I feel like this is a lesson. Oh, go ahead.
It also brings up the importance of informed consent, right? A lot of us who work in clinical trial management, we understand what informed consent is. And there is some conversation of sometimes the informed consent needs to be signed on the spot. And when dealing with certain marginalized communities or different communities, these are documentations that they like to take home and you speak with your family members about it. It's not a decision that you make on your own. So other factors increasingly need to go into the fact that an informed consent documentation and how it's reviewed, and the fact that these women in these situations here are the reason why they even exist amongst communities, to where they're taking individuals' human biological cells and things without their knowledge. So if you're in your profession that you have a way to input on the evaluations, keep these things in mind when you're creating informed consent overviews and application forms.
Right. And like even with the form consent, like you're saying, like having someone from the community explain it and talk about it before signing, like all those things are often overlooked. But okay, from the poll, I'm saying 95% are not familiar, which I think it makes sense. A lot of like this is not a story that's talked about a lot. So the women on the screen are the Ralph sisters. Their names are Minnie Lee and Mary Alice. In the first picture, it's 1973, and they were 14 and 12 in that first photo. And in 1973, they were sterilized without their consent or knowledge. Their mom, who couldn't read, signed paperwork thinking her daughters were being given birth control shots, but were instead taken to surgery, and their right to have children were taken away from them while they were still children. And the photo on the right is the two of them in 2022. And I just really wanted to include this because, again, when we talk about historical injustices that have impacted Black people, we need to remember that these are like people's reality. Like these are things people are currently still living with. So forced sterilization has really contributed to the mistrust of medical entities, and the lack of consent and the removal of autonomy can cause people to not trust healthcare providers and other health systems or researchers. So history that shows that people have the right to be fearful of these systems when like they have been harmed. But this also puts a disadvantage for people because if they're less likely to go to a healthcare provider, they're not going to get the access to care that they may need. And this medical mistrust can lead to them not scheduling appointments. It could lead to them ignoring medical advice. With the COVID-19 vaccine, that was a huge thing in the Black community where people were afraid to take it. They weren't sure if this was just more research, if it would actually protect them. And I remember being in a space with a lot of Black health providers, and they were having conversations of trying to convince people on why they need to get vaccinated because Black people are already disproportionate of dying from COVID-19, from getting infected. And it's like this challenge of trying to rebuild this trust, acknowledge the mistrust, and then still want people to be engaged with the medical system.
And with that, we see the influx of people of color and BIPOC joining. So not hoping for change, right? But being the change. More medical residents, more doctors, more research administrators, more investigators, more scientists, right? As we get more of these people in to get this research that even Rachel's saying we need more of because she's conducted it and it's hard to find. So making sure that we put ourselves in these places to be able to enact the actual changes.
Yeah. And on the screen, I just have a graph just showing sterilization rates in North Carolina. The red line is Black women. The white or the like purplish blue line is white women. And as you can see, between 1937 to 1966, Black women were more likely to be forcibly sterilized. And we continue to see this through desegregation efforts. And this is just a direct link to show like minimizing the ability for Black mothers to reproduce at a time where white people did not want to engage. They did not want to be in these neighborhoods with them. So just some data to back that up. Now, this portion of the presentation is very, 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 very important to me. Black maternal health is something, if I was a researcher, that would be the only thing I did because there's just so much to it. And I was also a track athlete from like 5th grade through high school. So Allison Felix, Tori Bowie, like these are all women that I watched when I was like 12. And I was like, oh my God, like I want to be just like them when I grow up. And it really upsets me. I cried the first time I did this presentation, trying not to do it this time. But these are women who are Olympic gold medalists. They have abs. They are so fit. They have access to so much money, to so many resources. And even though they have these extremely healthy lifestyles to be these like world champions, 3 out of the 4 women on the screen faced life-threatening complications due to their pregnancy. And I just make this point because looking at them, I'm like, they should be the healthiest, well-resourced one. They should have access to the best doctors, to the best care. They should have easy, long lives. And that's just not the case. And I just want to take a moment of stillness. So, when I first made this presentation, the only person I had on the slide was Tori Bowie, who she died from a pregnancy-related death, and it was a really sad story. She was found alone in her home, and again, like she is an Olympic gold medalist, and she died a preventable death. Most recently, Crystal Anderson, she was an NFL cheerleader for the Kansas City Chiefs, and she also recently died a preventable death related to her pregnancy. Beyonce, Serena Williams,
Serena Williams recently
right,
spoke about it.
there are so many Black women who are famous, who are rich, who are fit, who are having struggles. Allison Felix talked about her own struggles throughout her pregnancy. Like these are like this just shows that like with Black maternal mortality, like your education level, your economic level those do not act as protective factors. Being a Black woman puts you at such high risk for a pregnancy related death. And I still feel like this is a field in research that, like, yes, we know that there's this disparity. What is contributing to it, and how can we stop it? How can we prevent it? And from my work within public health and from being in more professional settings, the people I see attracted to this work are Black women because they are more likely to be impacted by this. And it's very rare that I see any other demographic that focuses on this topic. So when it comes to like these research proposals, like there's so much happening in these communities that can be talked about that are really being overlooked. So this is something that really, 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 really upsets me. And I think in my own career, like I want to see what I can do um, to minimize that disparity. So just looking at the impacts of healthcare, healthcare access and quality is so critical within the social determinants of health, and the past acts of injustice and oppression still impact health today. Due to historical racism in medicine, there remains like a really big underrepresentation of Black and African American healthcare providers within the US. Only 5.7% of all US doctors are Black. And the medical mistreatment of Black communities also poses an ongoing issue with the unethical medical experiments without formal consent, systemic racism in the healthcare system, disparities in quality of treatment, the medical discrimination and bias, and the cultural memory of past abuses and injustices. These all continue to foster medical distress, discomfort, and unwillingness to seek necessary care, and as a result, just continues to create that that gap of the disproportionate experiences of poor health outcome.
And
Oh,
just noticing, like asking about research and the laws on women's rights and how the research creates the law. So we notice in modern society right now, a lot of certain rights are being taken away as far as the governance of women and their own bodies. So it's very crucial that advancing the research to advance gender equality and promoting women's rights and addressing systemic barriers and inequalities that women face for this lack of preventative treatments, or because we know that some of the historical context is the surgical things that have been conducted on women, especially Black women, through slavery and through over time without the use of anesthesia, and understanding that, you know, a strong Black woman and the do we feel pain and the oversubscribing of opioids to particular community kind of started from the healthcare, you know, because of certain communities can't take pain in the way other communities can. So what is your stance maybe on the research you conducted and the women's rights over their own bodies?
mhm. Yeah, I think there's there's a big overlap. And when I think about the women's, I think especially with like Roe v. Wade being overthrown and like seeing like even in Idaho, just like challenging Supreme Court, I feel like within that, like the importance of intersectionality is so important. I think sometimes thinking of reproductive health, it is abortion, it is access to birth control, but it's also just like being able to have that consent. And for a lot of Black women, like it's not there. For a lot of women of color, it's not there. I feel like in the research, looking as far back as the experiments of experiments on Black women and within OBGYN, like that's the foundation of that care. And I feel like moving forward, there needs to be more of a conversation with that. Originally, I tried to do my research proposal for my capstone on that connection between those forced experiments, but like I'm not a researcher by by training. So I was just like, I'm not really sure how you look at this, but I do think there is a gap between that historical context. A lot of people don't know about that. Um, and I don't think there's a lot of research and attention brought to autonomy in general and what it even looks like to start with when it comes to women's health and reproductive health. So again, just another huge gap. Um,
And someone was curious about the percentage of Black physicians. So only about just under 6% of United States doctors are Black. So it's around 56% identified as white, around 17 identified as Asian, and then around just under 6% or 5.8 identify as Black.
mhm. Yeah.
So yes, sadly, very low to someone's comment. But you do see a lot because of what's going on in modern society. I do feel like a lot of young people are noticing and taking note and placing themselves, as Rachel has, into public health, into law and criminal justice, into healthcare, and understanding how this has affected their grandmothers and grandfathers, and understanding now the real impact that it wasn't that long ago, and bringing back to it, which I feel you can kind of see the unsure with some of the United States and the taking of education in certain places, because if you remove the education of the past, right, history tends to repeat itself.
Right. And also, it's been nice too, being in the public health program, seeing a lot of Black medical students who came and got their MPHs and then they're going to go to med school. So not only having those lived experiences, but also having the public health language to kind of map those things in the medical setting. A lot of people are like trying to have that more of that overlap as well, which is to me really encouraging.
It also brings in understanding the various needs of the ethnic and diverse backgrounds, right? There's certain religious backgrounds that you can't just, you go to emergency and they might strip you in front of things. And there's certain ways that you communicate and do things culturally, which isn't understood if you have a predominant race that identifies outside of the cultural norms. So again, just doing our research and making sure we focus our studies on these marginalized, not focus our studies, but include people on the marginalized in our studies.
Mhm. So we've reached the end of the presentation. Just some key takeaways from doing this. A holistic perspective is really crucial for population health promotion efforts, and it's paramount that we learn from the past to better understand the racial health outcomes we see today. History doesn't repeat itself, but it just continues on, and it's important to have that framework as we're doing research, as we're in the field and engaging with people. Um, I believe Black maternal health is a foundation for many health discoveries and really shape health for women currently. And if we don't pay attention to the past, we cannot create equitable health systems to support people today. So in conclusion, social determinants of health play a huge role in the way each individual and community experiences health. And these historical events must be examined to identify the origins of health inequity. And by identifying the connections between history and health outcomes, we can improve the health trajectory of our community members.
And as research administrators, understanding racial disparities and how they can significantly impact our proposal submissions and funding through systemic biases in the evaluation process, potentially leading to unequal treatment of proposals from individuals to organizations that are marginalized, disparities in access to resources and networks, and opportunities that can hinder certain groups. So keeping in mind that these disparities in funding allocations can perpetuate existing inequalities, with more resources going to proposals from already advantaged groups. So addressing these disparities and oftentimes educating the evaluators at some of the sponsorships that we're working in on why this research needs to be done and the quality of this research need to be done, even if this through non-traditional ways.
Mm.
Do you have any resources that you maybe could provide or tell membership on where they can go for research on Black maternal health?
Yeah, so I have a lot of sources that I did the lit review on that I can share out. So you can see like where I got my information from. Um, there's so much in like what was collected that summer. So not everything was talked about deeply. So if you want to see like more about like maternal health outcomes in regards to a lot of different topics, like we talked about, I will have links to that up there. But yeah, so all the sources will be available.
Are there any other questions for membership that you would like to pose to Rachel before we wrap up for this webinar? And I want to thank Rachel so much for providing this resource and your education to us. We've learned a lot. I think you placed a lot of framework and groundwork for a lot of people who had not know about a lot of these inequity and disparities amongst the community. And now we can go into our jobs and realize we don't just push paperwork. We're dealing with real people, with real situations. It's not that far removed. We can see the sisters. That's something that I wasn't that fully educated on that now I'm going to go learn more about. So hopefully you could take all this education and use it, share it.
Thank you for letting me speak to you all. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Before we go, someone wanted to know if you saw any disparities in your research in regarding to energy and poverty, like fuel poverty with maternal health.
I didn't look into that. So I don't have a lot to say on that, but that is like, again, like even like doing this, there's so much in it that like I even overlooked that. And I was trying to go through these historical timelines and have different determinants to frame them. But no, I did not see that. But I also wasn't looking for it. So but I'm sure that it's out there.
Understanding the challenges and the history of these inequities, what kind of suggestions would you provide to us on where we could go to bridge the gap in certain health outcomes?
Can you say the first part of the question one more time?
See, now that we have a better understanding, knowing the challenges and history of the inequities and the health disparities that are prevalent, what are your suggestions on how one can go to bridge the gap in some of the health outcomes?
I always think there's a disconnect between whether it's research or public health promotion efforts, and like I feel like there's a disconnect between the communities that are experiencing these things. I think there's a lot of knowledge in lived experiences. People are like there every day. They have these historical stories to share. And I feel like first, especially like on the research side, just like having that like in the science community and the research community, like having that knowledge available. So they say stories that back up like these associations and these numbers. So I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to bridging health outcomes. But I feel like the crossover between public health and research is like getting this research to help validate like these are why we want to do these programs. I'm a big like health promotion person. So I feel like having the research and the evidence to support these efforts is helpful for us because then I can be like, okay, like this article like showed like this. And then we can like start looking into programs. How do we work with communities? How do we have interventions? And then I think systematically there needs to be changes. There needs to be like revisiting of policies, revisiting of the investment of communities. So I feel like those like three buckets are kind of like what I think. And then I guess a fourth one within the medical profession, I do think public health education and that like access to research or to that relationship with community is so important to start like talking more, not just about the individual's health, but like what contributes to it. So those are kind of like what comes to mind when I think about reducing those disparities.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Rachel, for this amazing program today. And thank you all of the membership for joining us in this conversation. I think we learned a lot today that we can take back to our institution and our organizations to follow up and have some robust education and conversation around the disparities and inequities that we all should work to be addressing and to closing that gap. So thank you again, Rachel.
Thank you.